It was Miles Davis who said that in music, silence is more important than sound. The idea being that the dynamic between the two is what makes them effective individually. If you were to have just sound with no silence, it's just noise. This same train of thought can be applied to film. It's so often I see Hollywood films of today that are terrified of the idea of silence. Supposedly, every emotional moment can only be effective if accompanied by a rousing piece of score, and every scene needs to be high stakes, high tension, and always in service of the plot. So what it ends up feeling like is, in between all the action, noise, and relentless fast-paced plotting, is that you never really get a chance to just breathe. That statement, of course, doesn't apply to the works of the legendary Hayao Miyazaki, whose filmography I've recently had the pleasure of completing. I know it's taken me too long to get to this point, but after being an audience to the unparalleled levels of imagination and craftsmanship, it's scenes like this one from Spirited Away, arguably his best film and almost certainly my favourite, which I find myself constantly revisiting. It takes place around 100 minutes into the film, directly after the most action-packed scene, at a point in the 2-hour runtime where you'd expect the narrative to be reaching its most climactic moment. But what makes this scene so beloved by fans and so interesting to me is that it's a moment of complete stillness. Miyazaki has said that he wanted to animate the feeling of being a child and having to take the train on your own for the first time. The feeling of anxiety, of being so nervous that the people around you become faceless and the details of the world around become an endless sea of nothing. But within the context of the rest of the film, the scene is so much more than that. For one, it's a quite literal representation of Chihiro's journey from a naive and scared child into a now mature and responsible person. It also gives us our first look of the spirit world outside of the antics of the bathhouse, but most importantly, it provides the characters, and by extension the viewers, a moment to reflect on everything we've seen, as well as everything that's to come. There's obviously a million ways you can interpret the scene, but if you're a fan of Miyazaki's work, then you've probably heard him describe the principle behind it as ma, the Japanese term that roughly translates to negative space. It's most commonly used in Japanese poetry, where it defines the pause between phrases, which, as a result, evokes a moment of contemplation from the reader in order to give new meaning to the whole. In Miyazaki's words, ma is the time in between clapping. If you just have non-stop action with no breathing space at all, it's just busyness. But if you take a moment, then the tension building in the film could grow into a wider dimension. If you just have constant tension, you just get numb. Though Miyazaki's worlds and characters are some of the most imaginative and richly detailed in the medium, it's scenes like this from Howl's Moving Castle that for me define his filmography, where the pause in the story for a moment of reflection can not only be felt through the calmness of the environment, but can also quite literally be seen in the way the castle halts to a stop. Yasujiro Ozu also used a similar approach with what have been described as pillow shots, where a shot of nature or some traditional Japanese objects would serve as a visual and emotional resting point for the viewer as he transitioned between scenes. It's a concept which, for Western audiences, can be quite jarring to experience. We're so used to every movement within a scene and every scene within a film being dictated by the story. A moment of silence where characters just sit is so quick to be criticised as too slow or redundant. And you can actually see this in the dubbing of Miyazaki's films, where in the English language version, silence is often filled in with noise.
This is quaint.
Gigi.
This isn't dust on the floor, you know, it's flour.
This is of course partly down to a difference in cultures, but it can also be attributed to the difference in story structures. As opposed to the 3-act structure that we're accustomed to in the West, with the setup, confrontation and resolution, Miyazaki uses the 4-part structure called kishotenketsu. It's a structural method that originated in China and was used in poetry for 4-line compositions, but it has since grown to Korea and Japan and has been implemented into narratives. The 4 parts go as follows. Firstly, you have ki, the introduction, which functions almost identically to the start of the 3-act structure, where, as suggested by the name, all the important components of the film are introduced. The second part is sho, the development stage. The story, world, and characters introduced in ki start to expand and become more detailed, but importantly, no major changes have been made, up until 10, the twist. This is the crux of the story. It's the moment of change that everything has been building towards, which recontextualizes all prior events. And then ketsu is the conclusion, where the first 2 parts tie together after reconciling with the twist, leading to the end of the story, but not necessarily a resolution. If we put this template up against My Neighbor Totoro, we can see how it functions in action. Ki is fairly simple. Satsuki and Mei move into a new home, which they suspect is haunted. Sho, Satsuki and Mei start to explore the house and get friendly with their neighbours. Mei discovers the various spirits inhabiting their home and the forest nearby, one of which is Totoro. We also learn that the girl's mother is ill and is in hospital, but is planning to visit the girls soon. 10. The girls receive a telegram from the hospital requiring them to call. They find out that the visit from their mum has to be cancelled because she isn't feeling well. This causes an argument between the 2 of them and Mei runs off. And then Ketsu. Satsuki finds Mei with the help of Totoro and the cat bus, and the family reunites. More recently though, you can apply this same structure to the likes of Your Name, as well as Bong Joon-ho's Parasite. We're introduced to the family of the Kims, they infiltrate the house of the Park family, they then find out there's another family living in the basement, until finally, all hell breaks loose. As with all story structures, no story ever fits the exact framework. You'll find that if you try hard enough, Parasite and plenty of Miyazaki's films also follow a pretty conventional 3-act structure. But the thing that separates the 2, beyond the slightly arbitrary descriptions, is the way in which conflict operates. In the Western structures, conflict is so central to the development of the plot that it drives every action that occurs within it, starting with the inciting incident and ending with the climax, where at the end of the film, the satisfaction as a viewer comes from seeing it resolved. In kishotenketsu, however, the characters are far less proactive in their objectives and subsequently more reactive to the environment. For Miyazaki, conflict exists within the individual scenes, not as something that drives the whole. Kiki's delivery service is a film so against the stereotypical motifs that we're used to in the West, with no villains of any kind for the main character to deal with. One might presume it lacks conflict of any kind, but this isn't the case. Conflict exists in the smallest of moments, like Kiki having to avoid someone as she goes to the bathroom. Even in a film about witches and magic, the conflict is so wholly human, but more importantly, it functions as a way of exploring the thematic elements, Kiki learning to be more confident and independent being a key one. If Western films are about a character achieving a goal, then Miyazaki's films are about a character's journey. It's no wonder then that Miyazaki devotes so much of his runtimes to showing a character simply moving from one place to another, as opposed to the boring standard of an establishing shot of some skyscrapers. I think in the West, filmmakers become so focused on where the characters are going and what they need to achieve when they get there, that they often forget where the characters are and the space that surrounds them. And I think you can attribute Miyazaki's development of space not only to the structure of his stories, but also to the ways in which he writes his scripts, which is by not writing them at all. Miyazaki essentially starts making his films by drawing the storyboards. He often has no idea where the story will end up, and instead allows it to develop organically over time. What was initially a process designed to counter the demanding production schedule of animation has led to Miyazaki becoming one of cinema's greatest visual storytellers. Even with his films being so devoid of exposition and setup, Miyazaki's attention to detail with each and every handcrafted frame means that moments like Chihiro going down a staircase can express character and themes in the most simple of ways. The two-dimensional drawings are so full of life and motion that you can't help but feel a sense of emptiness in some of the CG animation backgrounds. I think Hollywood can learn a lot from Hayao Miyazaki and the films coming out of Studio Ghibli. Into the Spider-Verse has shaken things up for the better as of late, but even going beyond a fresh and interesting style of animation, not every silence needs to be replaced with noise. Not every journey has to be an elaborate set piece, and not every moment has to be dictated by plot. Sometimes, all you need is character and some space. Have a good one.